President Mbeki, it's a pleasure having you on this exclusive interview. Thank you very much, President Mbeki. It's a pleasure having you on this exclusive interview. And of course, welcome to the Mountain Kingdom.
Thanks a lot.
And to start with, President Mbeki, you were invited by the Lesotho Institute of Accountants to deliver a keynote address with regard to the new leadership paradigm for the African Renaissance and its impact on the African economies. What would you say are the key issues that your keynote address wanted to talk to?
Well, I mean, I think, let me put it like this. I think both of us know what some of the major challenges our continent faces. The challenges of poverty among many of our people, the challenges of underdevelopment of our countries in terms of roads, infrastructure, and so on. Challenges of peace and security and so on. I think we're all of us at one about these various challenges. And also the continent journalists agreed that we've got an urgent challenge to solve these problems. So the question that arises is, what do you do? And for this leadership thing becomes important. It becomes important because when you then say, all right, we've got a problem of poverty, and therefore a task of the eradication of poverty, what steps do you take to achieve that? And as I was saying, it's all of us across the continent agree that that has to be done. So that leadership then must be able to say, with regard to the matters of the economy, we need to ensure that our economies grow at fast rates, that whatever new wealth is generated is then invested in the economy in order to develop it, in all of that. And so the issue that arises is, where do you get that kind of leadership? Because it's not the fact that Thabo Mbeki gets elected as a president of a country or a prime minister or something does not necessarily mean that I'm competent to do those things. You might very well ask me, okay, what's your economic program? And I'd be tongue-tied because I'm saying personally, never mind that I'm an elected president, I might not have the capacity to do a thing like that. So you got to look broader and say, we need a leadership from our country, our continent, to address this matter. Where does this leadership come from?
And I'm glad the Deputy Prime Minister did echo to those sentiments and stated quite categorically that the issue of leadership is a very huge challenge across the continent, and not only across the continent, across the globe. What would you say, with your experience, President Mbeki, are the key characteristics, or rather makes a good leader across the global sphere, or with your experience across the globe, what would you say makes a great leader?
I'm not sure that I can answer a question like that. It's really because the task of leadership will vary according to issue, according to time, according to circumstance. Somebody who might be leader of an army might have certain characteristics, and a person who's a leader of a hospital might require different characteristics. But quite clearly, the task that has to be carried out is a proper identification of the problems that we have, proper elaboration of the solutions to address those problems, and proper implementation of whatever has been agreed. So you have to do those things. Now, what characteristics you need of the people to do those things, I don't know. But as I was saying, if you need to be able to elaborate the correct economic policies. You can't do it personally, you've got a leadership collective that must do it. To say, this is what we need to do. This is what we must do to implement, and make sure that you implement successfully and are able to measure the outcomes. That's the kind of leadership that is needed. So, and I'm saying it'll vary. The prescriptions about what are the characteristics of good leadership will differ depending on the task that you have to do, the circumstances in which you've got to do it, the time and space and all of that. But clearly, the principal objective is to make sure you change the lives of the African people for the better. Economic lives, health, education, all of that. What is it that we need to do? So I think that in that context, what the Lesotho Institute of Accountants decided was correct, that at this annual conference this year, it should focus on that matter. Because across the board, you see, even in terms of the accounting profession, that's part of your leadership for the country. It's not just your politicians. And I mean, the accountants, you are expecting them to, for instance, the Auditor General of the country, who checks whether public funds are being properly managed, properly spent, no stealing and corruption and wrong expenditure and all that, to make sure that these monies that are raised from the public actually go to the purpose of uplifting the people. You need the auditor generals, the accountants to do that. But if they are crooked, the accountants, you are going to fail. They will encourage the misuse of public funds because maybe they are getting a kickback, 10% or something. So the quality of the leadership of the accounting profession itself becomes important. That level of honesty, of integrity, and therefore capacity to do your work as is expected of an honest accountant.
And taking into account the immense challenges facing the continent at this moment in time, would you say Africa is doing enough to produce her own leaders capable of helping address those key challenges? We're talking economic growth that is failing to translate into helping the well-being, or rather reigniting the well-being of the African people. Would you say Africa is doing enough to produce leadership capable of helping address those challenges, or rather, we still have to work very hard as a continent to help realize or address those challenges that are in place?
No, but I think what we would, first of all, I think we'd have to acknowledge that over the last few years, maybe a decade, the continent has achieved rates of economic growth which had not been achieved during the previous 20, 30 years. The African economies did turn around. That's why you were saying economies are growing at 5%, 7%, and all of that. That's a positive thing. And it was a consequence basically of two things. One was the increase in the prices of commodities that continent exports, but also as a result of changes of policy. That was leadership. That we need to change our policies. For instance, in the past, right at the beginning, the general view on the continent is that it would be basically state companies that will drive development. That changed to become, it must be state companies plus the private sector, and therefore we must create the space for the private sector to be able to operate. That's part of the reason for this 5, 7, 8, 9, 10% rates of growth. That was good exercise of leadership. So I think that's the first thing we need to recognize, that certainly the African continent that produced a leadership which was able to produce those positive results. Whether it's enough is something else. Clearly it can never be enough, because in the end, we're talking about those high growth rates, we're talking about Africa rising, but the conditions of the people have not changed very much. So we're still not succeeding to eradicate poverty. So again, we call it a call on the leadership to say, what is this thing that we are not doing? We're producing higher rates of growth, which is very good, which all of us must applaud. But where is this additional wealth going? What are we using it for? Is it just disappearing into the pockets of people who happen to be in fortunate positions? And then the change, the condition of the people doesn't change. So I'm saying that's a challenge to the leadership. So you can't ever say we've done enough about leadership, because so long as the problems remain, they are going to require solutions. And part of the task of the leadership is to make sure that those solutions are provided.
And on that note, President Mbeki, what would you say are the key challenges that continue to compromise the true values of leadership across the continent?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear that we have a serious problem on the continent, I think, of corruption, of abuse of power. And many people across the continent, many of the political leaders I'm talking about, would use their positions of political power for self-enrichment. You know, and take it as a matter of it's of natural course that once you're a leader, it's expected of you that you must do that. No, you can't both be corrupt and be committed to development. You get committed to your own personal development by stealing public wealth. It's clearly a major problem. So it's a problem that needs to be confronted. And I think that in the end, because I mean, I might be in some government structure at whatever level and benefit from that kind of corruption. I get my own smaller percentage because I'm lower down, so I become part of the system. So the voice of the ordinary people becomes very important in terms of combating that corruption. Because to expect that the people who are in the corrupt circle are the same ones who are going to abolish it isn't going to happen unless you generate this popular pressure from below, so that the politicians and whoever in management positions and so on, so that they know that this is a view of the people and the people can act to get them removed. So it becomes important, but it is an important challenge.
Wrapping up this key issue of leadership, one other fundamental issue that I feel President Mbeki would be fundamental to talk to is the issue of the participation of women and youth who've for quite some time been left out in the leadership spheres. What did you say needs to be done to enhance the participation of women and youth at that level?
Well, yeah, I think that if we talk about the continent, the African continent as a whole, fortunately, the point that you raised quite correctly has been recognized by the whole continent certainly through the African Union. So there are specific decisions about women's empowerment, youth empowerment, and all that, which really require just implementation. So, I mean, what you would need to do, the challenges of the youth, some of the challenges of the youth, for instance, will be that I think a lot of our educational systems are not producing people through the educational system with qualifications that make them employable. So you might get people who come out of the universities with degrees and all that and end up being unemployed because nobody wants, there's no demand for this BA in sociology. So I'm saying that the question of the kind of qualifications people get, I'm talking about the youth, and their demand in terms of the economy, the public sector, and so on. That's a matter that would need to be addressed. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of unemployed graduates, for instance. But of course, it also presumes that the economy to absorb those graduates is also growing and demands that kind of labor. So I'm saying there would be specific things like that, which you need certain responses to be able to address that youth empowerment thing. Of course, you'd also have to address the issue of the role of the youth in terms of leadership participation. If we take in politics, clearly this is a matter for the political parties. Because throughout our continent, our politics starts with the political parties. They are very critical. So the political parties need to say, we need to institute a system within ourselves so that we are able to renew ourselves as a party by not just having old men and old women who stay there forever, but to be able to inject younger people. It would be the same with the issue of women. I think the issue of quotas, at its foundation, the African Union 2002 and its foundation, one of the resolutions it took was that in terms of the structures of the African Union, like the Commission of the African Union, which is your most senior executive committee, it must be composed 50% of men and women, as right from the foundation, and that has been observed all the time. So even those quotas become important. So I think those are certain interventions that you would need to make in order to empower women and youth. And it's got to be a conscious thing. It won't happen on its own.
Wrapping up our discussion due to time constraints, President Mbeki, what are the opportunities looking ahead? We're talking fast-tracking our economies, and not just fast-tracking those economies, but sustaining such development. What are the opportunities looking ahead so that such growth translates to the well-being of us African people?
Well, I mean, I think the point has been correctly raised, that we need to really transform our economies. Many of our countries still have maintained economies that were created during the colonial period. And you remember the colonial period said, the colonialists said, we've come to fetch raw materials from your country and we will sell you manufactured goods. And that was the colonial economy, which has persisted, unfortunately. So clearly what needs to be done is the transformation and modernization of the economies, so that we don't just export raw materials, we process the raw materials and so on, and higher value, etc. You create jobs and new wealth and all of that. That is the direction to go. And it's a major challenge in terms of the origination of policy. But it's also a major challenge with regard to what the rest of the world does. You would have heard, for instance, Deputy Prime Minister this morning talking about agricultural subsidies that the Europeans gave to cows and so on. I mean, you find a situation, he was telling me, for instance, that the cotton subsidies that the United States pays to the cotton farmers mean that something like 30 African countries that grow cotton cannot sell their cotton on the international markets. That would go the same for the manufactured goods. So you need a particular system of international trade which enables the countries, the African countries, to industrialize, but also to be able to access international markets with those industrial products. That requires another discussion on what happens to the global market with regard to those trade issues.
President, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And
thanks.
Wish you good health and all the best moving ahead with you, with your other endeavors.
Thanks a lot.